Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is lecture number 9 on literary forms and movements. The topic of today's discussion is Romanticism. Today's Romanticism is one of the most important movements of literature, and in today's lecture we are going to discuss a basic overview of Romanticism, pre-Romantic period, and the influence of Romanticism in literature. Students, Romanticism, attitude or intellectual orientation that characterized many works of literature, painting, music, architecture, criticism, and historiography in Western civilization over a period from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. Students, Romanticism can be seen as a rejection of the precepts of order, calm, harmony, balance, idealization, and rationality that typified classicism in general and late 18th century neoclassicism in particular. So students, it was also to some extent a reaction against the Enlightenment and against 18th century rationalism and physical materialism in general. Students, Romanticism emphasized the individual, the subjective, the irrational and imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. Students, among the characteristic attitudes of Romanticism were the following: a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, a general exaltation of emotion, of reason, and of the senses, of intellect, a turning in upon the self, and a heightened examination of human personality and its moods and mental potentialities. Preoccupation with genius, the hero, and the exceptional figure in general, and focus on his or her passions and inner struggles, a new view of the artist as a supremely individual creator, whose creative spirit is more important than strict adherence to formal rules and traditional procedures. An emphasis upon imagination as a gateway to transcendent experience and spiritual truth, an obsessive interest in folk culture, national and ethnic cultural origins and medieval era, and a predilection for the exotic, the remote, the mysterious, the weird, the occult, the monstrous, the diseased, and even the satiric. Students, now we are going to discuss the influence of these elements on literature of different periods. Students, Romanticism proper was preceded by several related developments from the mid-18th century, and that can be termed pre-Romanticism. Among such trends was a new appreciation of the medieval romance, from which the Romantic movement derives its name. The Romance was a tale or ballad of chivalric adventure whose emphasis on individual heroism and on the exotic and the mysterious was in clear contrast to the elegant formality and artificiality of prevailing classical forms of literature. Students such as these classical forms of literature are the French neoclassical tragedy or the English heroic copulating poetry. Students, this new interest in relatively unsophisticated but overtly emotional literary expressions of the past was to be a dominant note in Romanticism. Students, Romanticism in English literature began in the 1790s with the publication of the lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, usually named S.T. Coleridge. Students, Wordsworth's preface to the second edition 1800 of lyrical ballads in which he described poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, became the manifesto of the English Romantic movement in poetry. Students, William Blake was the third principal poet of the movement's early phase in England. The first phase of the Romantic movement in Germany was marked by innovations in both content and literary style and by a preoccupation with the mystical, the subconsciousness and the supernatural. So students, a wealth of talents including Frederick Hölderlin, the early Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Jean-Paul, novelists Ludwig August, Wilhelm and Friedrich Schlegel, and Frederick Schelling belong to this first phase. In revolutionary France, there are other scholars who were the chief initiators of the Romanticism by virtue of their influential historical and theoretical writings. Students, the second phase of Romanticism, comprising the period from about 1805 to the 1830s, was marked by a quickening of cultural nationalism and a new attention to national origins, as attested by the collection and imitation of native folklore, folk ballads and poetry, folk dance and music, and even previously ignored medieval and Renaissance works. So students, the revived historical appreciation was translated into imaginative writing by Sir Walter Scott, who is often considered to have invented the historical novel. At about this same time, English Romantic poetry had reached its zenith in the works of John Keats, Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley. So students, a notable byproduct of the Romantic interest in the emotional were works dealing with the supernatural, the weird, and the horrible. as in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and works by Charles Robert Maturin and E.T.A. Hoffmann. The second phase of Romanticism in Germany was dominated by von Arnim, Joseph von Goeritz, and Joseph von Eichendorff. So students, by the 1820s, Romanticism had broadened to embrace the literature of almost all of Europe. In this later second phase, the movement was less universal in approach and concentrated more on exploring each nation's historical and cultural inheritance and on examining the passions and struggles of exceptional individuals. Students, a brief survey of romantic or romantic influenced writers would have include Thomas D. Quincy, William Hazlitt, and Charlotte Amalie and Anne Bronte in England, Victor Hugo, Alfred de Vigny, Alphonse de Lamartine, Alfred de Musset, Stendhal, Prosper Mérimée, Alexander Dumas in France, and Manzoni and Leopardi in Italy, and Saavedra in Spain, etc. And almost all of the important writers in pre-Civil War America. Students, in the 1760s and 70s, a number of British artists at home and in Rome, including James Barrie, Henry Fuseli, John Hamilton, and John Flaxman, began to paint subjects that were at odds with the strict decorum and classical, historical, and mythical subject matter of conventional figurative art. Students, these artists favored themes that were bizarre, pathetic, and extravagantly heroic, and they defined their images with tensely linear drawing and bold contrasts of light and shade. Students, William Blake, the other principal early romantic painter in England, evolved his own powerful and unique visionary images. In the next generation, the great genre of English romantic landscape painting emerged in the works of J.M.W. Turner and John Constable. These artists emphasized transient and dramatic effect of light, atmosphere, and color to portray a dynamic, natural world capable of evoking awe and grandeur. Students, in France, the chief early romantic painter was Baron A. Gros, who painted dramatic tableaus of contemporary incidents of the wars, whose depictions of individual heroism and suffering in the raft of Medusa, and in his portraits of the insane truly inaugurated the movement around 1820. Students, the greatest French romantic painter was Eugene Delacroix, who is notable for his free and expressive brushwork, his rich and sensuous use of color, his dynamic compositions, and his exotic and adventurous subject matter, ranging from North American Arab tribe to revolutionary politics at home. Students, other scholars occasionally represent the last, more academic phase of romantic painting in France. In Germany, romantic painting took on symbolic and allegorical overtones, as in the works of Otto Runch and David Friedrich, the greatest German romantic artist, painted entirely silent and stark landscapes that can induce in the beholder a sense of mystery and religious awe. Students, Romanticism expressed itself in architecture primarily through imitations of older architectural styles and through eccentric buildings known as folies. Medieval Gothic architecture appealed to the romantic imagination in England and Germany, and this renewed interest led to Gothic revival. Students, musical romanticism was marked by emphasis on originality and individuality, personal emotional expression, and freedom and experimentation of form. Ludwig and Franz Schubert bridged the classical and romantic periods, for while their former musical techniques were basically classical, their music's intensely personal feeling and their use of programmatic elements provided an important model for 19th century romantic composers. Students, the possibilities for dramatic expressiveness in music were augmented both by the expansion and perfection of the instrumental repertoires and by the creation of new musical forms such as the light, nocturne, intermezzo, capriccio, prelude, and mazurka. Students, the romantic spirit often found inspiration in poetic texts, legends, and folk tales, and the linking of words and music either programmatically or through such forms as the concert overture and incidental music is another distinguished feature of romantic music. Students, the principal composers of the first phase of Romanticism were Chopin and Liszt. Students, these composers pushed orchestral instruments to their limits of expressiveness, expanded the harmonic vocabulary to exploit the full range of the chromatic scale, and explored the linking of instrumentation and the human voice. Students, the middle phase of musical romanticism is represented by such figures as Edward Grieg and Dvorak. So students, romantic efforts to express particular nation's distinctiveness through music was manifested in the works of different literary figures. Students, in our next lecture, we may compare this romanticism with idealism. Okay students, see you in next lecture.